Let me go ahead. All right, so in terms of how we're going to break things down today, we're gonna start out, I'm just gonna sit down with Ryan, we're gonna do a little bit of a fireside chat. At the end of that fireside chat, we can probably take up to like 2 questions from you guys and gals. If you have anything for Ryan, we can grab it then. Otherwise, we'll take the rest of your questions at the end, and if we can do that up on stage, we will. If not, we can do that off to the side, depending on where we're at on time. So we'll talk to Ryan, and then from there, Ryan and I are going to talk about some things, not only from an industry perspective, but also from a JSR perspective, alongside enterprise challenges and best practices. So we'll dive into that. And then we're going to talk just briefly about Cohesity and how we can help. All right, so let's go ahead, and I have my cheat sheet of questions, so we can dive right in. So again, thank you for being here with us. Appreciate it. So Ryan, can you tell us a little bit more about your background, but then can you also talk about JSR as a company?
Sure, yeah. So I've been in IT for more than 20 years. In various different positions. I actually started out in a non-traditional path. My background was biochemistry. I started out as an analytical drug research chemist working for Novartis. And I did that for a few years before I realized I really didn't want to be in the labs for the rest of my life. While I enjoyed the science, working around all the chemicals wasn't necessarily good for your health. So that being said, moved into supporting the lab system. So I was able to make that migration, became a sysadmin, supporting the lab systems. And from that, took on various different roles, grew in my position within Novartis, where I was managing teams that were responsible for IT for everything within the value chain life cycle, from the warehousing, inventory management, manufacturing, QA, QC, labs, all those different types of things. And so I did that for a number of years, and I got to a point where I felt like there was an inflection point where I had to make a decision on whether or not I wanted to be a pharma IT guy for the rest of my career, or if I really wanted to focus more on technology. And I decided I wanted to go down the latter path. I wanted to go into a broader technology role, really focusing on where I could use technology to help solve business problems. And so I took that opportunity to go join Microsoft. And I had a number of different roles when I was at Microsoft. But one of the ones I was in for the longest was as an enterprise architect. And I was in Microsoft IT, in a group that was supporting all the engineering teams at Microsoft. And so we were really working on, at that point, that was the initial transition of Microsoft's cloud and figuring out how do we refactor applications? How do we think about running applications on-prem going to the cloud? And so it was a pretty cool time, and learned a lot, and that was really interesting. And then I had another opportunity to continue on my non-industry specific growth journey, and I joined Charles Schwab. And so I joined as a software architect, and when I was doing that, I was there and I was working on modernizing mainframe code. So we had some 30-year-old COBOL code, and we were modernizing it to microservices based that we could run in the cloud. And so another interesting opportunity to go after that. And then moved into a leadership role, leading a large engineering team that was Schwab's equity compensation platform. And then I came across a role where I'd always wanted to keep building towards becoming a CIO. And I saw a job posting for someone who was looking for someone who had a pharma background and who also understood modern software development. I said, hey, that actually fits really well with what my background had been. And so I joined KBI. Well, when I joined KBI as a CIO, I didn't quite understand all of the structure. So KBI is actually a wholly owned subsidiary of JSR. But JSR has a very decentralized environment. And so when I joined KBI, I really was joining as a CIO of a very small company. Just happened to be owned privately. And when I was at KBI, I was in that role for about 12 months. I was looking at a modernization strategy. I was looking at different areas that we needed to work on. I also had cybersecurity responsibilities, and so created a strategy there that really was focusing on how we could modernize KBI, but also expand some of the services to other companies as I started learning about these other JSR companies. And after about 12 months in that role, I was asked to come into my current role, which is do that at a global level. And so what I'm doing now is I have responsibility from a cybersecurity perspective. I also have traditional IT responsibilities. And what I'm trying to do is really create enterprise services across JSR. So who is JSR? So JSR Corporation, we are a Japanese company. We're headquartered in Tokyo. And we are a conglomerate. We do a lot of different things, but really what we are is we're a chemical company. We're focused on innovation through material innovation. And so we have a long history of being able to have a lot of R&D with scientists who are able to help create new molecules, new ways to synthesize products. And we're organized into 3 different main divisions. So our first one is our digital solutions. And that's one we're probably most known for, which is we create a product called photolithography. And we are the largest producer of photolithography. And photolithography is a key raw material in the manufacturing of silicon chips. And so we are one of the largest producers of that. We do both for all of the large chip producers as well as the large memory producers. We are a key raw material supplier for that. We have a product that we create one of the layers that goes into flat screens, like these flat screens in front of us. We create a layer that interacts with in order to be able to create the pictures, especially like on OLED screens. Mm-hmm. We have a plastics business. That's one of our other divisions, and we make a plastic that is specific for cars and that is specifically formulated so that the cup holders don't squeak in the cars. So obviously a very niche little area for that. And then we have our life sciences business, which is where I started. In our life sciences business, we have multiple companies, but one of our 3 of our biggest are, we have a contract research organization called Bioscience. And what they're doing is they're working with pharma companies that if a disease process is known, they're doing gene sequencing and DNA sequencing to find drug candidates, and then they're doing efficacy and safety studies on those drug candidates before potentially giving them to patients. We have a contract development manufacturing organization, which is what KBI does. KBI works with pharma companies as well. Those are the customers. We take the drug candidate now, we take it from bench scale all the way up through commercialization. And so again, we're working on behalf of pharma companies. We create a drug product. We do first-in-human clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, as well as commercialization of drug products. And then we have a diagnostics business. And in that business, what we do is we create diagnostic test kits for hospitals. And so things like we just recently released a irritable bowel syndrome test kit that helps for diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome when patients go in. So you can see it's a very diverse company, and it's been really decentralized. And so in my role, there's been a ton of opportunities for how do we look at different systems. What are those systems that we want to have as standardized systems? What are those systems that really should remain localized and are important for those individual companies to be able to run their business? And so that's really where I am today.
So you have a very large organization that's globally distributed that also has a lot of different, almost like, I don't want to call them units, right? Sub-companies.
Yeah.
But it also spreads across many different areas.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of data, too, to manage.
A lot of data.
A lot of complexity, a lot of data.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your Cohesity customer.
Yeah.
We already mentioned that, right? Can you just talk a little bit about why you implemented Cohesity, just based upon your environment?
Yeah, I would say we're almost at Cohesity 3 different times. And so we started out, I first started talking to Cohesity when I was KBI. And KBI was looking at, we had two specific use cases. One, I was really nervous about the stat that Teresa had mentioned at the beginning of, hey, if you get ransomware, it's likely that you're going to have your backup encrypted. I really was nervous about that. I did not want to call the CEO and say, hey, our plants are shut down, we can't run, because all of our data is encrypted. And so that was part of it. We also had a use case that we have a lot of data is generated by scientific instruments. And that data, in a lot of cases, what we find is that the vendors for scientific instruments are really good at the science, and they're not as good at the software. And so we can't get that data from the instruments up to, say, a network or a cloud. The data can only be written to a C drive. And so we needed to figure out a way to how to protect that data. And so those were some of the initial use cases that we started to look at where we went and selected Cohesity. Since then, we've selected Cohesity, again, kind of going company by company as we still work towards this enterprise model.
Right.
And we selected them for another company where we really just backed up everything to the cloud. That company was already doing some backups to the cloud. And then another company, again, similar, where we had a use case sort of with the labs, but also where we wanted to use Cohesity to replicate data in a very efficient process.
Okay, so you're leveraging Cohesity not only for backups and recovery, you're also replicating your data. So there's multiple use cases.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
Definitely.
All right, so you also use AWS?
We also are an AWS customer.
Can you talk
Yeah,
about
so
that?
we have a couple different ways that we're using AWS. So in my area specifically, we're using AWS really from an infrastructure as a service concept. So we have some of our file servers are up there. We're hosting SAP in AWS. We also are doing, for some of the smaller companies that don't have some of the IT resources, we do infrastructure as service. So we'll host things like their servers. We'll host VMs up in AWS. So we have that. We also have another part of our group where we are building a lot of applications leveraging AWS services. And so we have the overall infrastructure of setting up our VPCs, using direct connect to connect our environments, leveraging a number of different tools that AWS has. We're building a lot of our own environment. We have a Redshift data lake up in AWS that we're using to help aggregate some of our data. So yeah, we definitely consume a number of AWS services.
Okay, awesome. So then let's dive a little bit deeper. You've kind of implied like some of the data types that you might have. Can we look at that a little bit more closely, your data types?
Yeah, so we are, I think, again, for us, one of the big use cases was how can we get some of that data off of our lab systems? And so for those systems, that was one of the first things is we had to be able to have something that could capture that data from the lab systems and be able to protect that data. So that's part of it. We're backing up our databases. We're backing up SAP, we're backing up Linux, we're backing up VM images. We'll be backing up, we're transitioning to S4 HANA, so we'll be using that to back up our HANA environment as well. So we're using it in a number of different spaces on pretty much all of those data types that I mentioned. We also use it we are using it for all of our office environments. So Microsoft 365, we're using it to back that up as well as our OneDrive environments and SharePoint Online.
Wonderful. All right, so you mentioned it took a few looks, a few takes to choose Cohesity. So what was the methodology that you applied when you chose your backup solution?
We really did look at a number of the vendors in the backup space, and many of those vendors are here. And so we were looking at that, and there was a couple of things that we wanted to look at. Well, one was the instruments, right? So I won't belabor that point. But the other one was just being able to, how can we capture that data and make sure that that data is protected as much as possible? How do we make sure that our backups don't get encrypted? Mm-hmm. And that was one area where we found that Cohesity was really above the competitors that we were evaluating, was that concept of immutability, and that once a file gets written, it doesn't get overwritten, and we understand the history associated with that file. And then the third thing for us was the concept where we have some of our implementations are on-prem or hybrid. And so we have a number of our companies where we have some on-prem hardware that can capture that data locally that we can then use from a DR perspective. But then we also have other satellite offices that we can then just have as a cloud only. So we have this hybrid environment, and it could really work with us, given that we had some sites that were pretty sizable and some sites that were really small. And then we also had constraints with different geographies. Mm-hmm. And so Cohesity really gave us the flexibility as we were thinking about some of those different constraints.
Okay, that's again, that complexity that you carry in your org. It sounds like it actually, what we were able to provide allows simplicity at its core, right?
Yeah, for sure. It definitely does.
All right, so then one last question before we see if the audience has any for you, and then we can transition to the next piece. So why do you continue to use Cohesity today?
Well, so we've like I said, we've chosen Cohesity already 3 times. So we've made that decision more than once that says, yeah, Cohesity is the right strategic partner for us. And one of the areas, again, was this concept that I was just talking about. The hybrid architecture is really important for us to be able to use from both a DR perspective as well as the backup and the security perspective. The other thing that we've found is we've seen some of the partnerships with Cohesity and AWS. And so, for instance, just this year, Cohesity was in Japan. And so we have a large presence in Japan. About half of our company is in Japan. And so it was really important for us to be able to have that data be able to be backed up in Japan, be able to be that region specific. So that was another reason where we continue to look at how do we expand that footprint, because really Cohesity is close to where we are. And so that's one of those areas. So not only the core features of that, but also there, having that close to there. The other one for us that we've been working towards is just being able to have more of some of the air gap copies of the data. And so having that kind of that third replica of an air gap copy of the data. So just in case, you never know, it's always nice to know that you have, if you will, a gold standard of a backup.
Excellent. All right. Let's go ahead and we're going to transition into the next section of our presentation. So really, our goal here is just to dive into some of the challenges that we've seen from an enterprise perspective, and then also talk about some of the best practices, because I think you really covered things high level, but there are a lot of details that go into those decisions, and that's where we'll kind of uncover that.
So as we think about organizations, as you heard, JSR is a very complex organization, has many different units to it, different geographies. But even without the complexity that JSR has, you have the type of complexity that you see here on the screen. Everyone has interactions both internally and externally with multiple different vendors, whether it be for things like purchase orders or invoices, or how you're doing your payroll, or any of these different types of things. All of these different areas add complexity into your environment, and they also start to introduce different data types. So when we think then, on top of that, is now we also have the complexity of many companies having on-prem, you have SaaS providers, you have different types of cloud environments. We are certainly going after a multi-cloud environment. We work very closely with AWS. Obviously, we work with other vendors as well from a cloud perspective. And for many of us as well, we have hidden SaaS. So we have our business units that go out and they might buy a SaaS service without even telling you about it, but you still have to figure out how to support and protect that data. So you put all of this together, and even if you aren't in a really complex environment, you might find that you have many of these same challenges. All right? And if you add on top of that, what does that add to your surface area? So when we think of cybersecurity, we always think about what is my threat surface area? And when you put an environment like this, and you put how many employees you have, and where are your employees? Are they remote? Are they on-prem? Are they going into different countries? All of these add to the point where you're generating data in multiple different areas. You're generating it in multiple different formats. It's transiting in different areas, and you have to make sure that you secure your data. So this is some of the areas that we deal with this, but then I deal with this like 12 times over. As I go from country to country and company to company. But I would say that really this is something that everyone has to deal with.
It is in some form of scale, right? It could be small, could be large, could be global.
I would say I was having lunch with someone today, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I'm a brand new company, and I don't have this old legacy environment that I have to worry about. We're all just natively in the cloud and all that," which is great. But if you think about this, they still have to deal with this too. They may not realize it, but they still have to deal with this type of complexity.
They do. All right, so let's start looking at some of the challenges that we're seeing from an enterprise perspective. So I've worked in many enterprises prior to Cohesity, and I know one of the things that I had to consider was that enterprise data may need to be kept forever, for example. So when you start talking about how long you're going to keep that data, I have to be thinking about how much data I have, where I'm going to keep it, and even how many copies to be able to pull that back. So how does that relate to your environment?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. We have a lot of different complexities. So I think of the data quantities. We are in the process of getting more and more and more data, especially in our Crown Bioscience, where we're doing gene sequencing and we're doing some of those types of things. The types of data is just generating petabytes of data. And so we are trying to figure out how do we capture that data, how do we secure that data, how do we back up that data. But yeah, it's all about data, and really in my perspective is really trying to make sure that we can continue to understand where that data is, making sure that we have that in the right geography. And so some of that could be regulation, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
We will.
But also some of it is kind of, for us, it's geopolitical. So parts of our company are regulated where we can't export data to certain countries. And so in some cases, we have parts of the company that can see data that can't see other parts of the company. So it becomes really interesting to do that. But that really has some interesting challenges for us.
And I think back to something you shared when we were sitting down and talking to you. Talked about replicated copies of your data. You talked about air gapping. You didn't, I don't think we went deep into that, but that's essentially creating a network gap of sorts, right? To ensure that data can't be attacked, but you're probably making a copy of that data somewhere else. So, you're probably keeping at least 3 copies of your data in one way, shape, or form.
We generally are. I mean, that's generally the direction. Again, some of it's aspirational. We haven't quite got there everywhere, but we ultimately want 3 copies of our data. So we definitely want the original, the backup, and we want an air gapped in some case.
Yeah, so I guess as you're sitting there in the audience today, I would suggest that you really step back and take a look at what you have from a data perspective. How many copies do you need to keep? Because it'll help you understand and identify how you might want to ensure that you can recover in really any scenario, even outside of cybersecurity.
Yeah.
All right, so this next enterprise challenge that we've both seen a lot around is regulatory compliance. So again, reiterating the replication piece, I think, is critical. But regulatory compliance are basically that set of rules that we have to follow from an organizational perspective to ensure data is encrypted, that access is secure. So what could you share around that with JSR?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, one of the areas that we service a lot of pharma clients. And so with our pharma clients, one of the things that we find is that replication of data, the encryption, because we're creating IP on behalf of those clients. And so for them, they're really, they put a lot of standards on us and wanting to make sure that their IP is secure and how they're doing that. And so the concept of being able to replicate that, having those replicas, again, making sure that they're, in often cases, geo-distributed in case there is some geopolitical issues. From an encryption standpoint, it's very key that all of our data is encrypted, both in transit and at rest. And then making sure that as well that we understand when that data is generated, we have to have the history of how that data was generated, who's made changes to that data, and being able to understand what that is. So all of those are really critical for us in order to be able to provide data for our clients and be able to show that we're taking care of their data and being good stewards of their data.
And I think one of the things we did talk about, right, you don't have a ton of PII, but I'm sure most of the organizations out here do, and I know I've dealt with that in the past. We do have to be good stewards of that and make sure that if something happens, not leaked, right?
Yeah, and it is. It's for those who aren't even in a, don't have to worry about GDPR, but even if you're doing data in the United States, there are so many new regulations that are coming out and how we're using PII. And I would argue that every company has some PII, right? If you have any of your employee records or any of your employee data, you have some PII, even if you're not maintaining customer data. So very, very quickly, you have to think about PII somewhere, somehow. You can't ignore it. So I mentioned a couple of times, and kind of following up on the question of, as we thought of this, was how do we think about backup and recovery speeds? And so we had some products that were doing some backups, but we didn't have enough of a confidence that they could do our entire environment. And so one of the areas that we were looking at when we did our vendor evaluation was how could we make sure that whatever the solution we had would be able to meet a large set of data for multiple different applications, as well as the data that those applications were being generated. And so that's really where we had that. And that's also part of the reason why we have two instances of hybrid implementation of Cohesity, where we have hardware on-prem, and we will have several instances of cloud-only implementation where we are just backing up to an AWS environment. And if we had a disaster, we would just run out of those AWS environments. And so that's some of the areas that we were focused on as far as kind of why were we looking at this. And we also are working towards the recovery testing. So with Cohesity, one of the areas that we have is the ability to have kind of a dev test environment where we can actually try some of those recoveries without having to do a full recovery in production. And so this is an area where we want to be able to continue to develop. And ultimately what we want to be able to do is have multiple iterations of our testing and our recovery testing on a year-over-year basis so that we don't have to be surprised and just hoping that we can recover in the event of a disaster or a potential security incident. And so this is all areas that we are leveraging Cohesity, and we're really looking forward to being able to continue to evolve and modernize and become much more mature in this area.
So I think for me, the biggest takeaway of what you said is plan for recovery.
Yeah.
Right? The backup, you don't want to just check a box and see that, okay, yay, they're green, like, yay, they're backing up. You really do need to take that step of planning for recovery.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you want to kind of start with the end in mind, right?
Right.
Why are we doing this, right? Why are you backing up? You're backing up because it is likely at some point that you're going to have an issue and you need to get back to that data. Mm-hmm. Hopefully it's not like an entire data center, but more often than not what it is it's someone who deletes a file and all of a sudden they're like, oh, I need that file. Or if, we've had an incident where we had a user who turned in their notice, and while we were processing the termination, that user went and deleted all the files out of the accounting shared files, which would have been a very big challenge to close the books, but we were able to recover all of those files.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So again, kind of threat surface area, and obviously users are always the biggest challenge, but that was one of the areas where we were able to take that and do a recovery.
Yeah, thank goodness.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. So we mentioned, again, it's not just backup and recovery. When we looked at why were we wanting Cohesity, what was great about it for us was the immutability, so data integrity. And I think in the world that we are going towards with more and more AI that's going to be in your workplace, understanding your pedigree of your data is going to be critical. And so having this understanding that if I have some original science data that's being created, whether that's to create a molecule for photoresist or to create a molecule that's going to create a drug product, I need to be able to understand that that data that was created is real. And so the concept of immutability for that data is going to become really, really important. I mentioned before as well that for us, being able to understand where and how we are storing our data is really critical. We have some of our big areas that we need on-prem. We need that on-prem just because we physically can't recover enough data if we had an issue. But we also have a number of places where we didn't want to spend the money to try to do that and create that infrastructure on-prem so we can just use the cloud. And then we also know that we have always edge is always fun and exciting to try to manage how we work at the edge. Yeah. So all of these were different areas that for us, we really considered, and we wanted to make sure that as we were working through this, those were some of the areas that we were focused on.
And so I would ask all of you, from a best practices perspective, again, take this list, maybe grab a picture of it even, and go back and compare with your organization and make sure that, if these things make sense, that you're doing them.
Yeah.
All right, so in terms of best practices from a compliance perspective, I find that this is also very individualistic to your organization, but I think it's critical to make sure that you're also reviewing this. One example that I'd like to highlight, I found that during one of the, or at one of the organizations that I worked in the past, it was a healthcare organization, we even went a step further. Of course, you think HIPAA right away. We were even doing SOX compliance. So I think sometimes it's good to not just do the minimum, but also do more. And then the other thing I want to call out on this list is MFA. I think we always trusted MFA, traditional MFA, as the way to protect entry to our data. But unfortunately, it's really now best suited if you also have FIDO2 alongside it, because our malicious attackers are now also able to get into traditional MFA. So I'm going to go ahead and, do you have anything to add on this?
I would just say, again, as I mentioned earlier, the compliance comes up no matter what. Mm-hmm. And whether you've been thinking about it or whether you stumble across it, compliance comes up. And so we don't have a lot of, as I said, we don't have a lot of PII, but we have PII.
Right.
We have new state regulations that are coming in on a very regular basis. We operate in California, so we already start with kind of one of the strictest. But we have GDPR standards. We have standards from other countries. And so a lot of times you also have to think about, even if you're maybe not doing business in that country, if you're storing data in that country, or even sometimes if you have data transiting through certain countries, you have responsibilities of how you do compliance. And so I think it's important to make sure that as you are considering what is the best way to do your backup solutions and what are you going to do with your data, just know that there's more and more regulators who are also going to be opinionated on what you should do with your data as well.
Are any of you challenged with the global organization? A couple? Or so maybe, otherwise you're pretty localized in your geo. I'm assuming that could be US or anywhere else. So just a few of you with the global challenge. Okay, interesting. I thought it was maybe a little more common. Now I'm realizing maybe it's not. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about, from a best practices perspective, the Zero Trust Maturity Model. So the Zero Trust Maturity Model is something that CISA.gov released sometime in the last year or two. And it's really guidance around how to handle your enterprise security. So one, identity. So how are you going to handle users and their access? Two, your devices. Are you going to let them use their own devices at home, or are you going to issue corporate, for example? Networks are also interesting because we have a lot of people who do work remote in this day and age, and so home networks can actually cause some challenges.
And I'll just add on to this. So we did see that recently at one of our sites with a Fortinet 0-day, the way the attacker got access to the site, but the way that they got access to the site is they actually hacked a user's home Wi-Fi, and then they traveled along the user's home Wi-Fi in to be able to exploit the Fortinet 0-day. So as much as I don't want to get into trying to manage users' home networks, just know that that's also one of those areas that from a security perspective is definitely out there that you have to think about.
Zero Trust also means you have some good security wrapped around those applications and workloads. That network example is an example of how that would be so critical. And then, of course, even data, how you're going to secure it. Is it going to be immutable, et cetera? Did you have anything to add?
So we certainly are trying to follow best practices around zero trust. I've seen some statistics that say that so many companies are going after zero trust, but it's really, really hard to do, and I agree. But that doesn't mean you don't go after it. I think that what we would say is that we're starting with data. If you can focus on making sure that the data is secure and the data is protected, that's a great base to start building on these other things. I wouldn't say you could ignore any of it, right? You have to be working on all of these things. But if you know that your data is secure, then there's a good chance that if there's something that's bad happens, you're going to be able to recover from that.
Another set of best practices, these align with part of the NIST framework, not the whole NIST framework. But foundationally, I think it's important to make sure that you do have a strategy or best practice in place to protect your data. 2, make sure that you have mechanisms in place to help detect threats. You don't want someone coming in on that home network, but of course it can be so much more vast than that. It can be as simple as an email exploit or an internet exploit. So make sure you have detection and blocking capabilities in place. And then I cannot emphasize more, make sure you have a recovery plan and do recovery testing.
Yeah, again, so we've talked a lot about this. For us, where we looked about where Cohesity is it kind of is booked in for us. One of the tools, and we have multiple different tools that are doing different things, but for us, Cohesity helped from a protect, how do we make sure that if the ransomware gets in, it doesn't encrypt our backups, but then how do we recover as well? So we're using it for those things. We also have a lot of great other tools that we're using on all of these different things as far as that, but yeah. And luckily in the scenario that I mentioned where the attacker tried to go in the home network and got through that Fortinet 0-day, we did have systems that detected it and stopped it, so it was not a big issue, other than the fact that we were like, oh, that's good that we have these other things helping to back that up. Otherwise, that could have been scary. Yeah, I would really recommend as you think about what is your solution set. There's not probably one tool to rule them all. There's multiple tools that you're going to need to be able to look at and use, and I think it's important to understand how are those tools going to be able to complement each other, and then can you use them for more than just one thing? So don't bring in just like the best of the best that only does one thing. Bring in something that can really complement and work with a bunch of other tools. And we've really found that with Cohesity as well. And actually, I forgot, because there was a scenario too that we found where Cohesity has a capability that alerted us that said, hey, someone's accessing some files that they normally don't do. We actually had 2 systems. Cohesity was one of them. We had another system as well that flagged that as, hey, this is abnormal behavior. So there is a component of Cohesity that also provides that detect.
In the detection,
yeah,
the anomaly detection.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, so this still aligns with best practices, but it does also align with methodologies that we apply from the Cohesity perspective. So I'm actually just going to build this whole thing out. So there's really 4 key areas that I want to cover as it relates to this slide. So first and foremost, we have the fault tolerance. So whatever systems you're building, make sure that you have the ability to have hardware redundancy, failover capabilities, replication, et cetera. The second part here is immutability. I feel like we can't say that enough. It's so critical, and it's actually a really simple thing to do.
Yeah.
So make sure that you lock that data. We call it data lock. And make sure that data can't be tampered with. The third thing is encryption, making sure that you have all of your data encrypted at rest, at flight. You can even leverage KMS to encrypt those backups. That's another option. And the last thing here really is just making sure you have appropriate security hardening across your platform.
Yeah, I mean, I've hit on a lot of these. This is a lot of the areas that we looked at. So we really focused on that kind of that fault tolerance. How do we make sure that we have that fast failover from our data centers? How do we make sure that our VMs can come back, our databases can come back for our on-prem systems? I talked a lot about, from a science perspective, that when we capture data from those scientific pieces of instrument, how important it is for us to have that data lock, that pedigree on that data. And then obviously I think the encryption and security is just kind of table stakes.
It has to be.
Yeah. So we all know data is growing, and it's going to keep growing faster and faster. And then especially as we start to add some of these new machine learning components on top of our data, that's going to be generating even more and more data. Everyone knows that data is so important to how your company runs and how your company is going to run in the future. And so understanding where your data is, how your data is generated, and how you can secure your data, both currently as well as in the long term, is really, really important. It's even if you don't think about the basic disaster recovery scenarios, it's just all of those components and understanding and putting data governance around that. All of those things are really critical that companies start doing. And I think that there's so many companies that maybe conceptually know some of that stuff, but don't have some of that put into practice. And I would really encourage you that as you're thinking about data, don't think about, okay, we're just backing it up and maybe I'm just part of IT and I checked the box and I did a backup. You really need to understand a lot more about kind of some of the context with that data. And so when you're starting to put your systems together, when you're looking at your existing environment, when you think about where you have data in the cloud as well as on the edge, it's important to make sure that you continue to focus on understanding where that data is interacting with each other and what are you doing to make sure that those interactions are clear and recoverable. For us, we have multiple different types of data, as I've mentioned. And with Cohesity, we're actually able to have multiple different policies on how we think about that data. And so what we're doing is for our VMs, for our servers, we're doing a daily every day, once every 7 days. Then I think we also do like a 60 and then a yearly or something like that. So we have multiple policies there. On our databases, we have different policies. On those scientific pieces of equipment, we have different policies. And with Cohesity, what it does is it does allow us to have those different policies depending on the criticality of what that is, or how much data it's generating, or how often it's able to generate that data. So that really provides us a lot of different opportunities. And so in some cases, we're doing that replication between the two data centers on-prem. Some cases, as I mentioned, we do that replication of data straight up into the cloud, up into AWS. And we aren't there yet, but we are looking at for one of our companies where we're going to be taking some of that on-prem replication, and then we're going to also do that third copy up to the cloud.
Nice. Yeah, and so that's the kind of the cloud archive element of things, right? To make sure you've got, again, multiple copies, put it in a different location.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to make sure that we have time for some questions from all of you. So originally I had a demo in here. When we get to that, I'm just going to skip over it. If you want to see our product in action, we're in the security area at booth 1572, so feel free to stop in there. But for now, let's just go ahead and grab the slides here, and then we'll wrap things up and take a few questions. So first and foremost, in terms of our solution, you have the flexibility to deploy our solution however you like. You could deploy that through appliances on-prem. You could install our software on HPE, Cisco, Dell, your platform of choice. You could install our software into the cloud, or you could run us as a service. So that's kind of that middle area. I think the other thing to call out in the middle part of my screen there is you've got the data protection. We have multiple pillars: data protection, data security, data mobility, as well as data access and data insights. We have some forward-looking stuff coming out on AI. I'll actually be doing a presentation on that at our booth on Thursday at 1:30 if you want to learn a little bit more on that as well. So with all of that at its core, I think the other thing that is important to note is that you can protect your data at the edge, in your data centers, and in the cloud.
Can we go back?
Oh, sure.
Now that you've jumped. I just wanted to call out on this slide, right? Now, this single pane of glass is a big deal for us. So the fact that we have multiple different domains, multiple different countries, we are on-prem, we're in the cloud, all these different things. Cool thing is with Cohesity, we're going to be able to look at just one pane of glass and understand what our data backups are looking like. So even though we are going across those multiple instances, with the architecture of Cohesity, we have the ability to, as we deploy and as we mature, we're going to be able to see all of those companies in one place. And so that for us, that's really cool. It kind of evolved a little bit as we were using the product. So we've been using Cohesity for about 3 years. So that feature has evolved a little bit as we use the product, but it has become really, really important.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for calling that out. I do like the single pane of glass.
Yeah.
I think I personally take it for granted that it's there, but it's a nice benefit. All right. So this really is just a summary of how to look at it. We already talked about the pillars in the middle, right? All starts with data protection. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. But if you look at the bottom of the cloud, right, I think this is the mindset. So you have the mindset of make sure that you can scale, do that simply. Zero trust security. We architect based on zero trust. We're leveraging AI, ML to power some of the product already today. But as I mentioned, we're actually going to be doing more around leveraging natural language models. And then in terms of third-party extensibility, we have a really strong security ecosystem. So if you are working with other solutions such as like Palo Alto or Cisco, like the XOR, we integrate with a lot of those SOC solutions. And we have a great team, high net promoter score as well. All right.
All right, so as we come to the end, again, understand your data. So as you think about your strategy, about where this is, it's really important to be going back to the slide with all the circles on it. Understand where you have data. Where is it being generated? I think it's important to really understand. I think for me, I've had several instances where we have data that's being generated or is being given to a third party that we weren't aware of. And so it's really important to understand where is your data coming from, where is it being stored, how is it being stored, and ultimately, if you have to bring your environment back together, so maybe there's a natural disaster, right? If you have to bring your environment back together, are you going to have all of the data and we'll be able to work together? And compliance from, even though maybe not all of you are as global, again, there's so many state regulations that are coming. If you don't have to comply with state regulations yet, you're likely going to have to comply with some state regulations. And no matter what, there's going to be something that you have to understand around your data and how the new policies that are coming out are there. And some of those are going to be industry specific. Some of these are going to be geography specific. So understanding that how do you comply with these things and being able to kind of go after best practices initially really helps as you think about your strategy. Security strategy is integral to thinking about data. And we think about why are we doing this? Why do we care about the data so much? It really comes back to security and making sure that you can get back to where you want your data to be from an original standpoint, making sure that threat actors aren't able to access your data or expose that data, being able to, if you have an encryption event or a ransomware event, knowing that you can be comfortable saying, I don't have to go try to pay that ransom and hope that my data gets unencrypted. So really making sure that this is integrated into your security strategy is critical. And for us, maybe a little bit aspirational, as I said, but test everything. I would love, in my role, for every one of our companies to be able to do a full DR test and run in a secondary environment on a regular basis. We're not there yet. But with Cohesity, my confidence in the fact that I actually have data that would allow me to do that, and I have an environment that I can do that as well, is pretty reassuring.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that great summary. Thank you for sharing everything that you did today as well, so openly and transparently. So thank you so much for being here. And Ryan, thank you again for sharing everything today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.